Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage Method Space. And I'm happy today to be joined by Adam Steiglitz and Joe Levitan to talk about action research and their action research podcast. But before we get started, if you are new to Method Space, just want to briefly introduce it. This is a blog community hosted by Sage Publications. And we're interested in all kinds of things to do with designing, conducting, analyzing research, and then writing about it and sharing our results in all different kinds of ways, hopefully to create some impact and real change and new understandings. And at the heart of this, you can see teaching and learning, because we feel that we're lifelong learners, and whether you're a new researcher, a student researcher, or an experienced researcher, there are always new things that we can learn. So we try to offer opportunities through Method Space to exchange ideas. So that kind of brings us to where we are here today. So why don't you both just introduce yourselves?
Sure, thanks, Janet. I'll go first. My name is Adam Steiglitz. I am a co-founder and director of the Andean Alliance for Sustainable Development, a nonprofit organization in the highlands of Peru. And I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Louisville in the College of Education and Human Development.
My name's Joe Levitan. I'm also a co-founder and collaborative director of the Centro Educativo Payata Ayu, or the Payata Community Education Center, which is a collaborative, culturally grounded learning space in the highlands of Peru. I'm also an assistant professor at McGill University in their Department of Integrated Studies in Education.
Well, thanks. And I want to just ask you to tell us a little bit more about some of those organizations, and to talk a little bit about your collaboration and how you came to work together. So here I've put up the website for the Andean Alliance. So why don't you start, Adam, just give us a brief overview of this organization and the work you're doing.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So our organization kind of has two pillars to it. The first involves working with high altitude indigenous communities here in the Andes, mostly farming communities. And, we help local communities here address needs that they've identified and have otherwise been unable to address them themselves. That typically has to do with diversifying crop yields as farmers to not only increase levels of nutrition and health, but also for economic purposes. And I would say what's unique as it relates to that is our approach in which we work with communities, which is really grounded in this idea of like strong relationships and them taking the lead on the projects that we're doing. So that means, a patient approach. We don't work within strict timelines, and we really work closely with community members so that we can help facilitate a process where their needs are being met. And then on the other hand, in the second pillar, we're an education organization. We host students, mostly from the United States, on transformative international education programs where students come down and they integrate within our organization and the communities that we work with. And I think what's important to point out there is it's not so much of, and while it is about the student experience and them coming down to contribute something to either our organization or the communities, more so it's about them coming down here and learning from local communities about the culture and history of the Incas, and the various ways in which how they exist here might fit into our own students' worldview and self-view. So that's also a very sort of relationship-oriented, participatory approach only to education.
Great. Okay. And so, Joe, why don't you tell us about the Payata education program?
Right. Great. So the Payata Community Education Center is what we call a culturally grounded and collaborative learning space where the students and parents really run the education center. So they dictate, or they are in charge of identifying the learning goals that they have, creating the curriculum, and then the teachers are seen as facilitators. So finding opportunities for learning about, whatever it is the parents and students and community elders want to learn about. So it's this really collaborative space. It's a really vibrant learning opportunity for students from as little as 4 years old to adults as old as 80 something. So we try to be very much embedded in the community. We focus primarily on cultural sustainability and leadership. So self-determination and community development, and really helping, kind of facilitating the process of community sustainability and growth in the ways that they define it, in the ways that they see fit. So it's really a work of facilitation. Like Adam said, we have very similar kinds of values about collaboration, facilitation, and making sure that the communities are driving the process.
Well, it's a good lead into my next question for you. How did you meet? How did you start working together? Tell us about your collaboration.
So Joe and I have been part of the same network for quite a while, but we actually didn't meet in person until recently, when we really got to kind of sit down and talk about all the things that we have in common. It was actually at a friend's wedding. And we realized that our organization, we both run organizations here with similar philosophies. And, Joe, he finished his PhD program, obviously, and is now a professor at McGill. And I'm currently a fourth year PhD student working on my dissertation. So we got to spend some time recently catching up about that. And then it just kind of snowballed into, a partnership where we realized we had a lot of the same, not only philosophies, but concerns as it relates to academia and research. And in short, that's what led to the creation of the Action Research Podcast.
Just to add to that, I think the idea actually started when, after that wedding, we were all going, Adam and a bunch of friends were going for a hike. We ended up talking about action research for probably about 2 or 3 hours in this really picturesque hike throughout the Andes Mountains. And we decided at that point, I just remember this moment, we were standing on the top of a hill somewhere and we were like, hey, we should do like a podcast or something about this. And it kind of ballooned from there.
Yeah, I remember that conversation too, Joe, because, I remember expressing to you some of the challenges that I was having as a doc student, especially as it related to like accessing information, right? Like I was working on my lit review and it was just so daunting, like having to go through all the journals in the library and just reading through all of these dense articles just to get little tidbits of important information. And I remember having a conversation with you, Joe, about how like there should be a more streamlined way to do that. And that was also what helped inform the creation of the Action Research Podcast, right? Because you can cater episodes specific to topics. You can put in your headphones as a listener while you're, working at home or doing dishes or on a hike or whatever it might be. And within 30 minutes, you've got a wealth of information that is useful to you as either a budding scholar, a student, or even faculty.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up. But before we go on to the talking about the podcast, so just I think the kinds of collaboration that we have, where we just like you're just describing, have an encounter, and we find someone of like mind, and find some common purpose. So in the work that you are both doing with your different organizations, do you have any cross-fertilization across those two organizations in the field, or primarily kind of more about what you're learning from that work?
Yeah, there's less direct connection between the work that Joe and I are doing in the field. Although we're in the same region, we work in different communities and in kind of different areas. But I would say from a process-oriented lens, there's a lot of overlap. I don't know if you want to contribute anything more to that, Joe, but that's how I would respond.
Yep, I think that's right. So, as both of us are very centered on the community and making sure that the community is really driving the process, we are kind of contextually bound in our own spaces. But we are part of this kind of network of community engaged workers. And so there's a lot of kind of information sharing or cross-fertilization in terms of ideas or, issues. I know Adam has this GIS or project that he's doing that was really interesting, and some of the procedural, kind of the process-oriented foci, and also dealing with some of the challenges that that we confront as people from the global north who are working in Peru and having a lot of students come down, because Peru is a big space for people who want to do volunteer work, and trying to troubleshoot together kind of some of those issues that we face when students come down with kind of problematic assumptions or ideas about the communities, and we have to work with them to address those. So I think those are the areas where we overlap. It's this kind of understanding and ideas sharing.
The comments you were making a few moments ago, Adam, about the literature review, I mean, I kind of, I had to smile, having worked with many doctoral students, and I'm sure that, many students listening to this could resonate with your comments, and even for those of us who aren't students anymore and still need to review the literature and try to keep up to date in our fields, there's a lot of reading involved, and sometimes you're having to go through extensive search and then also extensive reading to find the exact thing that you're looking for that fits with what you're doing. So, how do podcasts, in your view, kind of, help in that process? And so, maybe, talk a little bit about the process you use for your podcast and what you're trying to achieve with it, and how that might be different than, say, writing a series of articles or even blog posts or some other form.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And, I think the answer is at least twofold, right? As far as our approach to the podcast, because we're kind of, in itself, it kind of is an action research process in which we're figuring it out as it comes along. But we know that, as what we've done so far, there's sort of at least two angles that we're taking. One is just, it's a little bit more content oriented and straightforward as far as laying out the basics of, what action, it's very specific to action research. So talking about what action research is, what its foundational characteristics are, who might be interested, who might consider action research processes, more literature based or theoretical based approach to conveying, talking about action research. On the other hand, what I think is not more exciting, but kind of where we want to be going more with the podcast is bringing authors, researchers, practitioners onto the podcast to talk very specifically about either an article or an investigation that they're working on, where you can kind of lay it out as if it were an academic article, everything from the introduction to the lit review to the methodology, but have that be an interactive conversation where we can really kind of, push back on, and talk directly to whoever that author is and really pull out key points from their investigation and research that others might find useful and to bring into their own work. That could be something as, you could talk about pulling out a specific method. Recently, we had Dr. Blaine Harvey on to talk about systemic action research, and we broke that down from an action research lens. So I think as we move forward, we're going to be building on that model as much as anything.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry, I just want to add one quick thing.
Go ahead.
Just, for us, I think the idea is to demystify kind of the process of action research in terms of the actual steps and process through this interactive dialogue with, established and emerging scholars, and taking out and kind of pulling out key issues, key controversies, key moments of insight, key contributions to their projects, to make sure and boil down into 20 to 30 minutes so it's easy to digest.
Well, it sounds like it's beneficial not only to the listener, but also to researchers who, spend immense amounts of time to write books and articles. And then, beyond, say, the narrow group of people who might know that person's work and be interested in it, how do you reach other readers, and, how do you interest people in your work? So providing kind of a backstory and a little bit more kind of understanding about what they're trying to do would seem to be beneficial to the researchers and authors as well as to the listeners.
Yep, absolutely agree. And that's some of what we'd like to do and what we're working on developing in this podcast. As Adam mentioned, we want this to be building a community of researchers to figure out other ways of disseminating their work and making sure that the good work that a lot of people are doing is shared. We talked earlier about the writing and the lit reviews, and sometimes I think a lot of really good work gets lost because of some of the challenges with reading all of these different articles that we have to go through. We have information overload now, so distilling some of that into some really nice chunks, like Adam said, is really important to us.
Well, it would seem like you also gives you the opportunity to cross disciplines, and that's something that's so important to me. I mean, it might be that, say, someone would be interested in your international work in the organizations you described a moment ago, from a sociology or an anthropology standpoint, but then you've also got an education aspect to it. So, it gives you a chance to kind of reach across the boundaries, because as much as we love the scholarly journals, they tend to be kind of more discipline focused. So, if I'm, a business person, I'm going to read, this set of journals. If I'm an education person, I'll read this set of journals. So it seemed like podcasts would have the potential to reach people who might not otherwise be exposed to that, kind of research. So I guess to switch gears a little bit, talk about, why you became interested in action research, how you're using these methods in your own research and work in the communities that you've been describing.
Sure. Yeah, Joe and I speak a little bit about this on the podcast, and it's ironic because I think both of us kind of realized that we were doing action research without knowing that's exactly what we were doing. I know that for me, that came largely through the work that we do here in Peru with the Andean Alliance. Action research, at the core of it, it's kind of about taking a participatory approach to solving some sort of challenge. And here that, a key part of that had to do with identifying what that challenge is. Critics of development and these types of processes might, talk about top-down processes and how, especially outsiders or white men, or in this case from the United States, coming to Peru and telling communities, what problems they're having, and further how they might go ahead, how they might go on to address those challenges. Well, I know here, I can speak for both Joe and I, it's the opposite, right? You take approaches where you're building relationships with communities or students in some cases, really getting a good feel for what the problem or challenges that people are facing, and working together with them, to come up with ways to go about addressing those challenges. So, that's kind of on a macro level, the process that I take in Peru, and I think I can speak for Joe as well, to some degree at least. It's largely about that process of identifying the challenge with the people that you're working with, and the best processes for addressing them.
Yep, I think you hit the nail on the head with that summary. So just to add from my work and background, I think that action research was something that I kind of fell into accidentally, but then going through the PhD program and learning about all these different research methodologies and finding value in so many of them, but also realizing that my fundamental goal, because I came to PhD studies as kind of a practitioner first, was really to make sure that anything that I was doing was going to have real impact in the spaces and communities that I was working with. And so stumbling upon this action research paradigm, which is still, Adam mentions in one of our podcasts, kind of this small but growing island of research that is multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, that brings in a lot of different perspectives and can use a lot of different methods as its own methodology, is a really rich opportunity for a lot of people who are worried about the state of affairs in their communities. And what Adam said about kind of being collaborative and changing, making sure the power dynamics are more equal and social justice oriented, and then also being thoughtful about how we go about building these relationships and being participatory is really important.
Right. There's so much discussion today about research impact, and I think, given what we've been through in this last year with the pandemic and the implications of that, seeing, the problems we have are imminent. We can't kind of wait to go through the whole cycle of do the research, publish the research, and then think about impact. That, what you're describing, impact is woven throughout the whole experience. You're not waiting until you get to the end and then apply what you've learned. You're learning, applying, and studying, and planning and designing, through the entire process. So thank you for sharing those examples. I think they'll be of real interest to methods-based readers. And just, as a kind of parting comment, what suggestions, would you have for people who are thinking about, given our times, whether they're students or researchers who've already, more experienced, what should they think about if they want to consider these approaches for their own work?
It's a good question. Got to think about it for a second.
Well, while Joe thinks about it, I think I'll share at least the first thing that came to mind, which is, for me at least, which is the importance of relationships. If you don't have that, if you can't identify who the people are in which you intend to be working with, and how you can either create or maintain a relationship with them, that's probably the first thing you should be focusing on before moving on to any more, sort of more profound processes as it relates to the action research cycle. That would be my initial response.
And that's such a different paradigm from, even though certainly many researchers work in research teams, but still, we kind of think of the role of the scholar as being one that is, somewhat independent, and there's a lot of kind of solitary aspects to it. So, to begin thinking about, when you're thinking about yourself as a researcher, to think about yourself in relation to others, and, how do I become a strong collaborative partner? What can I offer, and what do I need to learn from others? I think is a very different mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would echo what Adam said and add that I think the focus of action research is, at least in my mind, is on learning. So as you mentioned, there's this cycle of research that in kind of traditional research approaches is seen as a little bit more spread out in terms of time. So you do the research, you do the analysis, you work on your specific articles. Hopefully those articles get read by some other people who then share it with others, and then eventually maybe it makes its way into policy or practice somehow. But that can take years. Whereas in action research, we have built into action research are these iterative cycles of action and reflection, collaborative, participatory action and reflection. So with these relationships that are key, which is, like you said, a huge paradigm shift. We don't position ourselves as outside observers, but as collaborative and kind of embedded observers who are also working at the same time. So that means that we can take the learning that we do even in one cycle to start to apply it in the organization so that the organization or the community can be a learning community or a learning organization. And I think that's really important. As you said, with things like COVID, the rapid pace of society these days, sharing that information is really of the utmost importance to make sure that, you know, people stay safe and people are able to learn in the ways that they want to learn. So I think action research is a really appropriate methodology for our times, considering everything that's going on.
So is there anything else you'd like to share before we close?
Go ahead, Adam.
Go for it, Joe.
Oh, I just wanted to make one disclaimer that's really important because ethics in research is really important. All of the pictures that are on the website were explicitly given permission to be shared publicly by both the students and the parents. So I just want to make sure that that is out there because I think that's really important.
Well, I think I think that is an important point. That it seems like especially the kind of action research you are both engaged in, where you're coming into another community, that coming from a place of respect is really important, and certainly fundamental to those relationships that you've suggested are so important. Because if people find that they can't trust you, then pretty much it's all over. So I think that also is a very different way of thinking about yourself as a researcher and your responsibility and research ethics, that it's not just filling out the forms that your university needs to approve your research to begin with. It's really threaded through everything that you do. Well, thank you both for joining us, and I hope that anyone who's watching this will be intrigued and take a listen to your podcast series.
Thanks for hosting us, Janet. And just a plug before we sign off. You can find the Action Research Podcast on most podcast distribution platforms, especially major ones like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And also our main platform for communication on social media is Twitter, where you can follow us at @the_AR_pod, or just search the Action Research Podcast. And we're working towards making this as interactive as possible. So if anybody has ideas of what they'd like to hear on the podcast, or if they think they have something interesting that they'd like to share and perhaps come on as a guest, that would be the best avenue to contact us.
Okay, great. Well, I hope that some of our methods-based readers who are interested in action research will contribute, and we'll have the full circle.